Welcome to StratNews Global. We're joined today on Talking Point by Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyaya, India's ex-envoy to Afghanistan, and StratNews Global editor Surya Gangadharan. Ambassador, the horrible attacks on the Sikh dharamshala in Kabul, 25 people at least killed there. The Taliban immediately saying it's not responsible, the Islamic State claiming it twice. Uh, who is really responsible and who is behind IS? Because the Sikhs were saying it was an Urdu-speaking attacker as well. Is this again what we were talked about so many times? Pakistan and ISI's plan B, if there is some kind of a peace process, if the Taliban come into a government structure of any kind?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Look, I think they clearly made a connection. Whoever conducted this attack clearly made a connection with Kashmir. This strongly seems to suggest that there was at least some kind of Pakistani fingerprint to this attack. Now, the IS itself is a complex phenomenon. I don't think we can completely reduce it to just Pakistan or the Pakistan intelligence agencies. But clearly, there are links. And as I said, it's complex. Sometimes they work against each other. Sometimes they work against the Taliban. At areas, there is a kind of commonality of interest. I'm not sure if there's cooperation, but there are elements from various jihadi groups who are part and constitute part of the IS. So it is not just the simple, clear and clean separate organization. There are many, overlaps.
So the question which strikes me is the attack on the Sikhs, at this point, is this a message for us? Is there something else here? Are they muddying the waters? What is it?
I think there does seem to be a message for us. IS always has had has targeted minorities, and in this particular case, they have targeted a particularly vulnerable and minuscule Afghan minority. I think clearly, particularly if we see that there is a Pakistani fingerprint to this, there clearly does seem to be a message that we are targeting people who are, in some sense, distantly or otherwise linked in terms of religion or community with the larger majority in India.
Ambassador, if you go to what happened post Secretary Pompeo's visit to Kabul, and then he immediately flew to the base in Qatar to meet Mullah Baradar and the Taliban as well. But the threat to cut off $1 billion immediately, another $1 billion next year, relooking at other projects, even relooking at donor conferences in the future. Yeah. How do you see that threat really working?
Really, very worrying. There are two ways one could look at it. It could just be a threat so that the Afghan political parties, get their act together. But there is also a possibility that this is more than a threat, that this is actually a message that they are ready to withdraw. And this could even be compounded by, other internal problems within the United States, and in particular, I think at this point of time, coronavirus. But I think, the point to make here is two. One is that clearly, there is a lot of, impatience and exasperation over the squabbling within Afghanistan. And, that is widely felt. It is felt within Afghanistan as well. But I think political squabbling is par for the course in most countries. Of course, it's a particularly grave one in Afghanistan. I'm not sure political squabbling is a good enough reason to either threaten aid withdrawal in a country that desperately needs aid. It depends on it for its daily functioning budget, let alone the fact that there is a resurgent Taliban violence after a kind of peace agreement with the United States. And there is the very real fear of a massive, effect of the COVID-19 pandemic in Afghanistan, given its proximity to Iran.
Ambassador, I'm particularly looking at the Indian angle here. We've committed around $3 billion. There have been lives lost there, Indian lives.
Yeah.
What are we getting? I mean, looking ahead, are we seeing all that investment, that labor out to nothing? I mean, what are we looking at here?
I don't think, one should look at it firstly in terms that investment in very accounting terms. I think that investment has achieved its purpose, which is to create a kind of public goodwill and also a certain amount of political goodwill in Afghanistan. That, regardless of what happens, I remember a very scathing quotation by a leading Afghan politician who said, regardless what happens, India is now in our hearts. So I don't think that capital is lost. I'm sure if the Taliban also feel that if the Taliban actually are Afghans and have Afghan sentiments at heart, they would also realize that whatever their other antipathies or distance with India may be, that India has made a positive contribution to Afghanistan during this period, and this is shared by and large among the Afghan people across all communities.
When you're talking about the capital, Ambassador Mukhopadhyaya, then just going back to what the US is doing in terms of its threat. Now, soon after that, President Ghani in a televised address orders the security forces to cut $1 billion in spending.
Right.
But he's also moved to announce a 21-member negotiating team, which is, of course, only government names on that. There are women there as well.
Right.
And there is movement to maybe the other politicians also coming up with a consolidated group of negotiators to talk with the Taliban.
Right. So I think the message has been there for quite some time that the United States is now withdrawing militarily, but that it could lead to further cuts, including financial cuts. And I think this message had got home to the Afghan government some time back. Now, whether they can actually make as much as a kind of drastic $1 billion cut in their defense budget or their national budget, it's an open question. But do bear in mind, there have been studies to show that basically NATO costs are much higher than, let's say, what armies cost in South Asia. So it's a question of entirely two different standards and models. And if the Afghan government was capable and was serious about a certain kind of, let's say, indigenization of the armed forces, there is a lot that they can do. And one could even argue that there is a lot, Afghans fight well, and Afghans have fought low-cost wars extremely well in the past. And you just have their, resistance as the Mujahideen to the Soviet intervention to refer to. So, I think the important thing here is that the message has gone down, and I think the system will now try to prepare for that. That's the first part. On the reconciliation, on the talks, and on the negotiating team, well, it's a good move. I think it's very clear that everybody recognizes that whether or not peace talks succeed or not, that under the current circumstances, you have to give it a try. And the first obstacle to that has been forming a negotiating team and getting a consensus in the political establishment, in the Afghan political establishment for that. I think this is a good starting point. The numbers have increased from 15 to 21, but they're still trying to work out that consensus. I think actual peace talks, the US is putting a considerable amount of pressure on this, but Taliban violence has resumed and has been quite bad in recent times. So, and there is the whole prisoner issue that is still there. So there are still a number of issues that come in the way of the start of the peace talks. But I don't think there's any doubt that whatever reservations people may have, peace talks have to be given a try.
No, Ambassador, the one point strikes me. The US has been stepping on the gas, really to get the peace deal through and get their people out. Now, in a sense, that leaves this Afghan government in a bit of a limbo, really.
Absolutely.
The US has demonstrated a clear resolve that it doesn't want to dirty its hands in the Afghan pie anymore, and it wants an exit. And it's kind of more or less decided that the Afghans government can be left to its own devices, sink or swim, whatever. Is that the message which is now really?
I think so. I think that is the message that I draw from 2-3 developments, and that's certainly the message I draw from Secretary of State Pompeo's visit to Kabul, and then the announcements of the 8 cuts, and then his visit to Doha to meet the Taliban. I think it would be prudent to assume that the United States has decided enough of this squabbling, enough of our intervention. We are taking care of our counterterrorism interests with the Taliban, and we are fed up, and we are now going to leave it to the Afghans to sort this problem out by themselves. But I would actually go a little further. If you put together three messages, one is the Sirajuddin Haqqani interview in the New York Times. Of course, that's not a state initiative, but nevertheless, we have PR outfits that work for that. And if you take the telephone call between President Trump and Mullah Baradar in Doha, and then you take Secretary Pompeo's Kabul visit and the announcements of cutting off of aid, and the fact is that even if they may have stopped violence against the US and the allies in Afghanistan, violence against the Afghan National Defense Security Forces and in general has in fact spiked considerably since then. So the temptation is that perhaps the US is coming to the conclusion that not only are we going to leave the Afghans to fight for themselves, but that in the longer term, their better bet are the Taliban.
Wow. Wow. Now, you mentioned the Mujahideen and the fight against the Soviet Union earlier. In that light, what Dr. Barnett Rubin has written op-eds and given interviews on, he sees it comparable, if not exceeding, because of US pressure internally to deal with the coronavirus and the amount of money that they will have to spend there, that the impact on Afghanistan could exceed what happened when the Soviets broke up.
You're talking about the specific impact of coronavirus? Yeah. Well, the Afghan health minister himself has gone on record to say that it could affect as much as, if I'm not wrong, and I could be checked on this, 80% of the population.
Yeah, he said that.
Yeah. So this is disastrous. I think he's correct that the danger is there. Now, of course, the danger is at this point of time a danger. We'll have to wait to see which is a bigger threat, coronavirus or Taliban, or whether the Afghans should cave into the Taliban because there is the coronavirus threat hanging on top of their head. And I hope that whoever argues for this is not making an argument for that. Yeah, I think it's a very serious argument. Afghanistan is extremely underprepared for it. And I think the aid cut from the United States is particularly badly timed, particularly taking that into account.
I was taking that a little bit further. The argument is that the US will be concentrating on corona and needing to spend so much money over the next year or more that they will not financially or otherwise be able to help the Afghans. So that impact, not just corona's impact.
Of course, that is correct. That is correct. This just seems to be just one more excuse added to many others to withdraw. And I think it is in line with the kind of bipartisan sense in the United States of getting out of it.
Ambassador, let me get back to this question that has been asked before, about our contacts with the Taliban. Officially, we say we have none, I would presume we do at various levels. Which faction or not, one is not very clear. But has the time come for us to kind of put this thing aside and say, okay, let's deal with these guys?
I think, in my view, the time will come, the main point here, the time will come when the when the Taliban actually say they are ready to talk to whatever negotiating party the Afghan government and political parties put before them. So far, they have been refusing to talk to the Afghan government. Now, there are two ways of talking. One is that you are talking in order to make a deal behind the back of the Afghan people and the Afghan government. That, I think, in my view personally, has been and is a no-no. And I think until the intra-Afghan talks begin, that shadow will always be there. But, to talk to the Taliban as part of an effort for peace in Afghanistan, as part of the general, dialogue and the multilateral dialogue, I would say, to bring peace and regional dialogue to bring peace, I think this is very much in order. And I think when the time comes, India should be ready to talk to all parties and not just talking about the Taliban, to play a positive role in bringing about any hope for peace in Afghanistan. And in that context, I think talking to the Taliban is right. And but a lot depends on the Taliban willingness to talk. See, so far, what we have seen with them is the willingness to make peace with foreigners, outsiders, let alone Pakistan, with which they are allied, but not willing to talk to the Afghan people and the Afghan government and even the Afghan political parties. So I think that's the first step, that at least the Taliban should make an announcement that for the sake of Afghanistan, For the sake of the Afghan people and for the sake of peace, they are willing to talk to the other side in Afghanistan.
But have we missed the bus if you're saying that we should be waiting till the intra-Afghan talks begin with the Taliban, especially with the political flux? There is no real government, even though you're saying everybody is backing President Ghani. Abdullah is still intransigent on that fact as well. So us backing the election process, having a government there, which is the normal playbook, are we missing the bus now?
No, I would not think so. If you see carefully, both the Taliban as well as India have held back really harsh criticism of each other. Even if you take this incident of the Afghan Sikh community and what Surya was saying about the possible Indian angle. I mean, the
Taliban even issued a statement saying that there's no connection with Kashmir when Pakistan tried to bring up the peace process.
They issued a statement. So I think the Taliban is open. Look, we must remember, for a lot of people who are pessimistic that or are fearful that we may have lost the bus, please remember that talking with India. Sorry, there's a connection problem here. Talking with India is the biggest prize left for them after they have open contacts with the rest of the world. So there is, Hindustan, India means something to Afghans because it's so closely tied to their history and culture. And that is does not bypass the Taliban as well. Even if you look at their sources of inspiration, if you look at the fact that one of their prime sources of inspiration is yoga, where is that originally coming out of? So, look, the Taliban do attach a certain value to India. To the extent that they are an Afghan force, they do. To the extent that they are held back by Pakistan, that's a different question. Even if they want to, even if we want to, there may be restraints on us and them to be able to talk, including where do we talk to them. Of course, now there is a presence in Doha, but don't forget that presence is easily monitored, and there could be, there could be inhibitions.
Where does that leave the northern provinces? The Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the former Northern Alliance.
Yeah.
Is there something that's going on there between us and them, or between them and the Taliban, or between them and Ghani?
Well, I wouldn't be able to answer that question since I'm not in government and I'm not privy to what happens inside government. But yes, there are two elements that are, I think, notable here. Firstly, it is worrying that the political fracture at this moment, to some extent, I mean, we can't say that Ghani's side is just one, ethnic group, but to a certain extent, the big fault line does have a large ethnic dimension, though it's not complete. So I think that is something worrying that needs to be watched, and I think India as someone that has been at least historically close to all sides in this in the internal political fault lines in Afghanistan could and perhaps should play a positive role. But the second point that I think that you mentioned is that how does it impact on us or whether we are doing something? I think it is too early to say. I think Afghan sides are capable of reaching a kind of political understanding or consensus amongst themselves, and that's what we should be doing.
Ambassador Mukhopadhyaya, thank you so much for that perspective on Talking Point. Surya, thanks for joining as well.
Pleasure talking to both.